Kids could head downstairs for Sunday school. And the rest of you, if you have your Bible with you, I invite you to take it now and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It'll also be on the screen beside me here if you'd like to follow along there. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning at the first verse. Now for the matters you wrote about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another that. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to say unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? May the Lord bless the reading of his word.
Thanks, Rick, for reading that passage, I think. In fact, I kind of wonder, Rick, if you'd like to just stay up here and preach it. Is marriage an unnecessary evil? A necessary evil? Is it God's provision for those who cannot control their desires? Spiritually speaking, what's better, marriage or singleness? Is God more pleased with sex in a marriage relationship or with celibacy in the single life? Does God ever permit or allow for a divorce? And what about remarriage for a widow, a widower, or even someone who is divorced? Now, last Sunday, we enjoyed a very inspiring message, and it was preceded by a couple of brilliant acoustic guitar solos from our guest preacher. I've been asked over the last few days, so John, what are you going to do to top that? I said, I am going to be doing some gymnastics this morning. Now, I know some of you are going, John, I can't imagine you doing gymnastics. And let's be honest, some of you are thinking, I don't want to imagine you doing gymnastics. And it's true. Now, as always, I have never had a body made or suited for gymnastics. Now, in phys ed in high school, I really liked football and basketball and floor hockey, even running, but I hated gymnastics. The pommel horse. I could never straddle my legs properly over the pommel horse. And then you had these ropes in our gym at high school, and then you were going to hang on some rings. This body was not made for hanging on rings. And then there was the vault. You had to vault over a wooden apparatus. Surefire collision was going to happen with me. And then there were, of course, the parallel bars and floor exercises. The mat would be out. The idea was that you were to do somersaults and tumbling. Well, I could tumble, never intentionally, never part of any kind of program. I really hated gymnastics. But today, I am going to be doing some gymnastics. Bible teaching gymnastics. Think of a balance beam. Now, I know some of you are thinking, John, in Olympic competitions, males do not do the balance beam. That's a little interesting tidbit for you. It's restricted to female gymnasts. So think of women on the balance beam, and you know what it's like. Kind of breathtaking at times what they can do, but there's a lot of risk. They've got to be cautious. They've got to be careful. And above all, as inferred by the name balance beam, they've got to stay balanced. They can't tilt too much one way or too much the other way. Or think of a tightrope. You know what it's like when you're watching someone on a tightrope, and you hope that they're careful. They're taking a great risk, but they've got to maintain their balance. They can't go too far one way or too far another way, or they're going to fall. Their life will be endangered. And you know what it's like when you're watching someone on a tightrope. Your anxiety level is very high. Well, this morning, it's like we're going to be walking on a balance beam or walking on a tightrope as we navigate our way through a very important part of Scripture. 1 Corinthians 7 requires great sensitivity. It requires balance. It requires care. And I hope this morning you're willing to give me a bit of a safety net. If I lean too far one way or the other way, I'm sure that God will get us back on course. 1 Corinthians 7, an interesting passage to say the least. I am very familiar with 1 Corinthians 7. I've officiated hundreds of weddings, and without fail, when we do premarital counseling, in one or two sessions, reference is made to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The issue of singleness. When I was a younger man, I wrestled with what is best, being a single man for Christ or being a married man for Christ. And over years, I have counseled many, many, many young adults in matters pertaining to singleness. And then divorce. Well, I've got to tell you that with divorce, I did a thesis paper in seminary on divorce and leadership, little knowing that a few years later, I would be called to a church, Byron Community Church, where the matter of divorce and leadership was hotly debated, and it was a very practical issue that needed to be resolved. And then the last time 1 Corinthians 7 was referenced here at Byron Community Church in this sanctuary was a few years ago when, after preaching from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaching on divorce, a couple of our visitors, street preachers here from the city, got up and rebuked me for the teaching. and quoted from, do you remember? 1 Corinthians chapter 7, one of the verses that Rick just read for us. 1 Corinthians 7. A key in 1 Corinthians 7 is context, context, context. I would submit to you, 1 Corinthians 7 is one of the most misused and abused chapters in all of God's Word. Part of the reason is a lack of paying attention to the context that Paul is writing in. This morning, there's going to be a lot of what about questions. Well, what about this? What about that? Why does Paul talk about this and Paul not talk about that? This indeed could be one of those sermons, as in our second part next week, where you're going to leave with more questions than answers. And sometimes that's okay. Also this morning, I'm aware that this is a very personal area for many of you. You will have noticed I titled this morning's message, Marriage, Singleness, Divorce, and Remarriage, the balance beams and the tight ropes. But for some of you, this is not just a theological exercise. It's an up-close and personal topic. Some of you are very sensitive to some of the matters we'll talk about today. Some of you maybe have struggled with some of these issues in the past. Maybe you're currently struggling, and maybe you're aware of someone in your family who is struggling with some of these issues today. And just as we can be scared when we watch someone on a balance beam or someone up on a tightrope, some of you, your fear level has likely ratcheted up. You're going to go, is this walk across the balance beam, is this walk on the tightrope going to rivet up my guilt? It's going to be kind of a 2-week prolonged guilt trip. Well, if last Sunday was Compassion Sunday, in some ways I'd like to refer to this Sunday as Compassion Sunday Part 2. I have prayed over the last few days fervently that this message would be bathed in compassion. Having said that, please turn in your Bible to 1 Corinthians 7. Be prepared to watch me up on the balance beam or the tightrope. I'd even invite some of you to come along with me. Let's just read the first verse and then the 9th verse. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And verse 9, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Was Paul anti-marriage? Is sex bad? Is marriage and the sexual component in it just provided for those who can't control themselves? Is marriage second best for those who could be referred to as the burners? I've had some fun with that in my thoughts. Mischievous part of me. Can you imagine we're going to start a new group for adults in our church called the Singles and the Burners, those who burn with passion. I'm not suggesting to you that you ask that as a question to say to someone, hey, are you a burner? Might be a little bit inappropriate. But you have to admit with me that verse 1 and verse 9 aren't exactly a ringing endorsement for marriage. And again, the mischievous part of me has been tempted a couple of times. You know how on a wedding card you'll put a nice message to the couple, and I always put a verse. Usually it's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I have been tempted more than once to put down 1 Corinthians 7, 1. Can you see the couple? Now for the matters you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, and then maybe put in the words happy honeymoon. Enjoy some marital bliss. Well, I believe that the real key to understanding where Paul is going is found in verse 1. Verse 1 is the key to the rest of the chapter, 39 more verses. And here is the $64,000 question. With inflation, it's now about $88,000. In verse 1, is this Paul's opinion, or is Paul quoting a slogan or a maxim that was in the Corinthian church at the time? Now, after very careful study, a lot of reflection, a lot of rolling up the sleeves and grunt work, I would quite agree with at least my translation of this passage in the New International Version that has little quote marks around, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." We know from studies and research that in the Corinthian church, there was a faction who were over-enthusiastic about celibacy. Abstinence in the single life, of course, but extended that to the married life. The best and most spiritual marriage was a sexless marriage. Now, why? Why would they think that way? We don't have a specific reason, but let me give you a couple of speculative guesses. One is that we know that we see in the New Testament Gnosticism, pre-Gnosticism. I'm not going to go into detail, but it was a dualism in thought between the spirit and soul and the body regarded as evil, and this thinking often led to very negative views on the body and anything to do with the body. We also know that asceticism had crept into the church. We'll talk about it, think about it a whole lot more as we move our way through 1 Corinthians. This was a very rigid approach to life. Enjoyment, looking at anything God would give us that would fulfill us, satisfy desires, would be viewed very negatively that way. But as I've thought about the passage, can I throw out an idea here? That as we discovered a couple weeks ago in 1 Corinthians 6, there was a lot of sexual immorality around the Corinthian church. And I believe that they thought the way you combat sexual immorality is you throw out the baby with the bathwater. The way you deal with immorality is no sex. If you get rid of sex, if you say to people, don't engage in sexual relations or sexual activity, that's the way you will combat sexual immorality. I would argue then in verse 2, Paul, by saying, but since sexual immorality is occurring, isn't in a narrow way saying, this is the only reason why you should get married. But what he is saying is, the way you are dealing with the prospect of sexual immorality is counterproductive. I believe what would happen is there'd be men in the congregation going, oh, I've got to be real spiritual. I will abstain from sexual relations with my wife, but they'd sneak out, as we discovered in chapter 6, and maybe go to the prostitutes. So Paul is saying, this approach to marriage is unrealistic. It's not the way a marriage should work. It's not the way a married husband or wife has been wired. It's unrealistic. It's just not going to happen. It's as Paul is saying, this hasn't worked for you, has it? So let me tell you the way it should be. And you see Paul counteracting this negativity that we often see associated with marriage and more particularly with sex. We go back to the early church fathers. I would often get asked when I taught at the Bible college, where did the negativity about sex originate with the church? Well, take the early church fathers, a lot of it based on their understanding of 1 Corinthians 7. John Chrysostom, who was a famous church father, said virginity stands as far above marriage as the heavens stand above the earth. Jerome, good old Jerome, a great church father, said, all those who have not remained virgins, following the pattern of the pure chastity of angels and that of our Lord Jesus Christ himself, so in other words, all of us who are married are polluted. That's quite drastic, eh? Not only are we burners, but we're polluted as well. And then Augustine, I really like Augustine, but he has said about marriage is not a good, but it is good in comparison with fornication. Again, not exactly a ringing endorsement of marriage. But here Paul comes along, and he is going to present what I would argue is a positive view of marriage and sexual relations. We see in verses 2 to 5 that each man, each woman in marriage should take the sexual part of marriage as a responsibility. What I really like here is this idea that as we fulfill our marital duties, we need to see that your body as a husband actually, in a profound way, belongs to your wife. And reverse, the wife's body belongs to you. Heather, aren't you lucky? All of this belongs to you. You should be astounded, as I am, that this passage is incredibly countercultural. And this is going to be a real key as we move ahead into some tough passages about women later in 1 Corinthians. This was not the way it works. In the culture of Corinth, men had control over women. Women were second class. Did you see the equality here? The husband and wife, the mutuality, the equality. I don't buy the fact that Paul was anti-woman, and we see this especially in this passage. And then you see this interesting exception. We're not to deprive each other, which means do not defraud, do not rob. You have an obligation, you have a duty. You and I would agree it's a delight, a duty and a delight, but there is a concession by mutual consent for a time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, let's be careful we don't force meaning into this. It doesn't mean that in order to have a prayer life, you can't have sex. But what Paul is saying is kind of like our Muslim friends, right? It's Ramadan right now, and you know how they're fasting, so they have a specific focus or whatever. And Paul is saying there will be times, there will be seasons, there will be occasion where abstinence is appropriate, but only for a time, because Paul quickly comes to this idea of protection, and you want to have these rails or these boundaries that protect your marriage so that Satan will not tempt you. When Paul at the beginning of verse 6 says, I say this as a concession, there's a lot of debate. I would argue the concession, and not a commandment, is this idea of abstinence for a specific time. Paul's saying it's not a command. I'm not saying you have to do this, but I'm saying that's an exception. I would appreciate that or understand it. Now, please note with these first verses that Paul is not presenting to us a theology of marriage. He's not saying, in just a few verses, I'm going to tell you everything you'd ever want to know about marriage. Nor is he presenting a theology of sexuality. Same thing applies. Some of you are saying, John, I remember years ago you preached on the 3 Ps of sex and marriage. There's procreation. Well, procreation isn't talked about in these verses. What about pleasure? It's not talked about directly. Protection is very definitely referred to here. And some of you would say, oh, isn't it? You know, if somebody came to me and said, I'd like to get married to Susie, and I'd say, well, why do you want to get married? So I can have sex. And I'd likely say, well, do you love her? Are you out for companionship? Are you wanting to build a family? Nope. Sex only. Well, I think you'd agree with me. That's a pretty shallow response. So we have to appreciate Paul's objective is not to present a comprehensive presentation on marriage or sexuality. He's dealing with a specific issue, and that issue is it appropriate to practice a sexless marriage or to abstain from sexual relationships, to be celibate in marriage? I would argue Paul is saying no, and that's the general principle. But even there, he doesn't address issues like aging. He doesn't address if one of the partners has a physical illness. None of that gets addressed here, so we need to be very careful in how we appreciate or apply this passage. So then what about singleness? Paul in verse 6 goes on to say, and in verse 7, I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another that. Now to unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Paul's strong preference, full stop period, is singleness. I say that unapologetically. There's no way you can twist this passage to say something differently. Paul's preference is the single life. But then Paul very quickly says, but I do regard this as a matter of giftedness. Now, when we get into 1 Corinthians 12, we'll discover that Paul uses the same word for gift as he uses here. This is a gift of grace, the gift of singleness. I would say to you, some people have the gift. Some people don't have the gift. And Paul is saying it's on that basis that you discern God's will and God's leading in your life and what is most appropriate, singleness or marriage. So years ago, I'm teaching in the college, and I taught there over 25 years, a lot of module courses. One was counseling, and I'd always get students coming up, most of them in their younger 20s. But there was one girl, I'll call her Mary. She was a bit older, loved Mary. She had a terrific sense of humor, a single lady. And one day the topic came up, and at a break, Mary came up and said, so John, let's talk about this gift of singleness. And I said, oh, do we have to? No, I didn't say that. But she said, so what do you say, John, to someone who doesn't want that gift? Wow. And then she very quickly added, and she said, I know people, maybe she was referring to herself, who don't believe they have the gift of singleness, but find themselves in a single state. Hey, what do you say to the single person who is a burner, who burns with passion? That's a tough question. Not an easy question at all. And for those of you who are part of the Sunday night small group, come out next week and Ron Burns is going to answer that question for us. I don't see Ron right now, but yes, I think he's helping downstairs. So just say to Ron, we're looking forward, Ron, to how you're going to deal with some of the questions that emerge in that passage. But what I want to say about singleness is this, that I think we have to appreciate that Paul is pro-marriage, I've argued that, but also pro-singleness, and we need to evaluate the circumstances and the situation. Now, you know that in the time Paul wrote, and in the early church especially, into the medieval church, singleness was valued more than marriage. Did you know that? There's been a shift. In today's church culture, often marriage is valued more than singleness. And often, unfortunately, we can end up treating singles as second class. And Paul would say, you've got it all wrong. You should, and we're going to develop this a whole lot next week. If you think this is all Paul has to say about singleness, just wait till we continue in chapter 7. I would say as a church, I would love to be known as a church that is pro-marriage and that is pro-singleness. And I've seen people on their journey. I told you about Mary. A few years ago, I got a call here at the church. And it was Mary, now in her 40s, saying, John, I met a guy. I want to get married, and I'd like you to officiate the wedding. And up here at Pioneer Village, I had that privilege. I've counseled a lot of other men and women who have remained single, and God has used them in a mighty way. Let us be known as a church that values all people, whatever their lot in life. Well, in the last few minutes, let's go on to something really easy, the issue of divorce and remarriage. You need to know, somebody asked me last week, why didn't you give the guest preacher this next assignment in 1 Corinthians 7? I said it was an issue of compassion. And Josh, I love Josh, but he's had a couple of tough passages. This is not one for aspiring preachers. If I get in trouble, I've been around long enough. I think you'll give me a little bit of grace. But so divorce and remarriage, the key verse in the passage, shouldn't have closed my Bible, is 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10. Actually, here's the verse our street preachers quoted. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, a wife must not separate from her husband. At the end of verse 11, and a husband must not divorce his wife. It's very true, the Greek word that gets translated separate or divorce, we have differences legally. Back then, it's basically the same idea, the same concept with separation and divorce. So it would seem that the matter is pretty clear. No divorce. There are at least 4 contemporary views of divorce and remarriage. I've actually done a fair bit of rereading of some material the last few days. Here are the 4 views, and every view has about 10 subsections. But here they are for you. The one view is what I call no divorce, no remarriage. Very prevalent in some movements. Those of you with Catholic background would appreciate that. The second view is divorce in only a few cases, but no remarriage. The third view is divorce and remarriage for adultery or for desertion. And a fourth view is divorce and remarriage for a variety of circumstances. Divorce, adultery, desertion, but abuse, particularly abusing a spouse or even worse, abusing children. There are many who would say that's warrant for divorce. Let's go through this quickly. Verse 10 is the general principle. It's the ideal. And I want to say this about as powerfully as I can. God's intention is that marriage be permanent. Did you hear me? Do you agree with me? That's the standard. That's the ideal. Marriage is to be permanent. Hundreds of times I have been on a platform and I've said to a couple, whom therefore God hath joined together, let not anyone put asunder. I love that I don't use the word asunder as part of my regular vocabulary, but it gets the point, doesn't it? But you knew it was coming. Isn't it interesting that Paul says, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. So Paul has some familiarity with Jesus' teaching on divorce. And Jesus said, you shouldn't get divorced, but there's what we call an exception clause. in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, in his teaching when the Pharisees came to him in Matthew 19. And that exception is porneia, which in that case refers to adultery. Now, don't get me wrong. Every violation can be forgiven. And the goal, as we see in verse 11, is restoration. But in this case, what Jesus is saying is the person who refuses to repent, the partner who is in a prolonged adulterous relationship, whatever, Jesus says it's not the ideal, it's not best, but he permits divorce in that kind of situation. Now, another $88,000 question. Why didn't Paul refer to this exception clause in verse 10? The very best scholars answer, we don't know. Now, I'm not the very best scholar, but let me take a guess. I always like guesswork. I think Paul is assuming, because it's a general principle, that people would be aware of the exception clause. Paul is referencing the Lord's command here as if there's awareness. In some ways also, though, it's like if I called you to my house and say, there's a problem with one of our toilets. Could you help me fix it? Actually, I'd be saying, can you fix it? Not can you help me fix it? But then you come into my house and say, well, John, there's a couple of other issues. I could help you with some electrical work. I could fix your cupboards. I could paint your walls. But I say, no. Right now, my focus is on the toilet. So I would argue Paul here isn't as concerned with all the parameters. This, again, is not a theology of divorce. But what Paul is doing in light of verse 10 and 11 is addressing, I think, a concern or a question that the Corinthians might have had for Paul. If they already, as we are assuming, believed that sex can have a way of defiling a marriage, which isn't right, Paul's addressed that, but doesn't it make sense they might have also thought, for the person who converts to Christianity was pretty new at this time, and is married to a spouse who's not a believer, won't it defile them to remain married? Shouldn't they push for some kind of separation or divorce? And the gist of Paul's argument is this, as you see in verses 12 through 16, that a person who is married to a spouse who has not become a believer is to stay in that marriage. I've had opportunity to give this advice in situations where someone becomes a believer, their spouse hasn't become a believer yet, and the encouragement is to stay in the marriage. Paul uses an interesting reason for that, this possibility of sanctification. And that's a bit hard. What does Paul mean here? It's not salvation, because he uses another word for salvation in verse 16. I think what Paul is saying here is that you can be a blessing to that spouse who isn't saved. Just as, should encourage all of us, children can be blessed in a home where there is a believer or a couple of believers. This is something that as evangelicals we're cautious about. No, I'm not saying that someone becomes a believer through osmosis, but there is that influence, the impact of the believing spouse on the spouse who isn't a believer. Did Paul's friend Peter agree with that? 1 Peter chapter 3, right? The influence of the believing wife on her husband who isn't a believer, as much through her actions as through her words. So Paul's advice is stay in that relationship. But what if the spouse says, I don't want to be married to a Christian. I have no interest. I'm going to move out. I'm going to go my way. I would argue on the basis of verse 15 and 16, Paul says, in that situation, you're not bound to the marriage. If the partner takes the initiative, moves on like that, you're not bound. I understand that meaning you are free to divorce and remarry. Are there those who have another view or a different understanding? Absolutely. So I have many wonderful Christian friends who have been deserted and choose to remain unmarried. I have a lot of respect for them. But I've been in situations where appropriately, where it has been analyzed on a biblical basis, where somebody who has been deserted opts for divorce and remarriage. Wow. Are you looking forward to next week? I'm still up on the tightrope. Next week has got some really good material, but let's do a quick recap, okay, just as we close. And just make sure you take this away with you. Is Paul pro-marriage? How many are saying no? Okay. Would you agree with me? Just even a little shake of the head. Paul is pro-marriage. Is sex bad? No. I, this morning, have tried to be appropriate. I don't want to be explicit. I could have been more explicit today, but I want us as well not to feel like we have to sidetrack around it. A lot of people use 1 Corinthians 7 as what I call the spiritual launching pad. They go, okay, this is what's said about marriage, but let's look at the other issues with marriage, like finances and communication and the whole bit. They're all important, but Paul is saying, hey, that sexual component of marriage matters. It is important. Is Paul pro-single people? You better believe it. And if you're not convinced, I'll have another shot at that next week. Should we be pressuring single people into getting married? Why do we do that? Why do we feel justified in doing it? Why do we make some people feel bad that they're not married? Paul would likely say, I want to be balanced here. I'm on a tightrope too, but whatever you do, don't look down on those who are single. Some of you are single because you're a widow or widowed. And again, Paul would be saying great sensitivity, great compassion is needed in these kinds of areas. Divorce, I get asked, what about the guilty party? What about the victim? There's 1,000 nuances to divorce, but I will say this. Regardless of your situation, divorce is not the unpardonable sin. And we need to have a community that is accepting, that is forgiving, and understanding when it comes to all people in all situations. God is a great God, worthy of our praise and adoration. If you can, read up. Go, okay, I can't wait to see what else is in 1 Corinthians 7. Don't use it as an excuse to not be here next week. But we'll look forward to next Sunday. And I'm going to ask Rick, Donna is ready here. Stand with us as we close the service, please.